Welcome back. In studio with us today, we have our returning guest, Hira Khan, a CAPPA and DONA trained labor and birth doula. In today's episode, we'll talk about Hira's book for children called A Gift From Jannah. We'll also discuss postpartum depression. Welcome back to our show, Hira.
Thank you.
So I know you recently worked on a book, A Gift From Jannah. So, as we start the conversation on that, did your work as a doula inspire or lead you to write that book in any way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think being a mom was the biggest inspiration. And then being a doula and being able to see this miracle of birth constantly throughout the last 7 years really was what inspired the story.
So what is the book exactly about?
Yeah, so the book is about birth. When I was expecting, there was very little resources available in the community. 7 years later, there's still very few resources available for children to learn about the process of birth. And I think it's really important to note that they need to know their origin and where they came from. And children are so curious, so we have to answer these questions for them. Otherwise, they'll learn them on the playground, right?
Yeah. What age range is the book targeted for?
It's targeted for ages 5 to 7, but I do have several clients who have, for example, young newborn babies or babies in the NICU that they are reading this book to.
So just a question for you. What would you say to some parents who say, well, I don't think my child needs to know about this right now?
Yeah, I think a lot of parents are probably thinking that right now too.
Yeah.
That's a very valid point. The first thing I want to say is that, I'm a parent myself. So I took that into consideration when writing the story and preparing this book. So it's really left up to the parents' interpretation of how they want to spin the story. What I do in the book is I do kind of give anatomical references, and I think it's really important to honor that. So I do say things like, I do use terms like the womb, instead of, telling children that they're in a tummy or a stomach. I think it's more appropriate to give the womb some credit and call it, the womb.
That's true.
Yeah, and it's really a good balance for those children who aren't really ready for the birds and the bees talk yet, but it kind of feeds into their curiosities and their imaginations in a really whimsical way.
So I guess you're trying to give it more of a realistic, but still leaving it open to the child.
I think, yeah, it is a bit realistic in terms of, what the mom's role is. I think it's really important for children to understand the spiritual connection that they have with the parents in utero, even before that they meet them, and how God has predestined this for them.
I want to ask you more questions about that because I'm sure it's going to give the book away, but where can people go to pre-order your book?
So you can go to my website, which is www.birthkeeper.ca, and there's also some testimonials and reviews of the book on there as well.
And in terms of other resources, I know you touched a little bit about not having the right resources out there for kids, but maybe broadly talking about a pregnancy and things related to that. What are some of the resources out there available?
For children?
For moms.
Oh, for moms, yeah. There's a lot of resources. There's great support groups out there. Now there's Facebook groups. There's also a lot of different pamphlets and videos. I mean, the great thing is we have so many birth documentaries now, which we didn't have too many years ago. So it's really, birthing resources have really come a long way. If you even just you YouTube something, you'll find too much, it's almost too much information. So what I think is really important to do is kind of stick to reputable sources, because otherwise you can absolutely get lost.
And what are some of the, those are just broad resources, but specifically on challenges women face during birth or after, what are some of the resources available to them on that?
Yeah, so something doulas do is actually postpartum care, for example. So what we do is we may not be hired with the client for the birth or the prenatal visits, but they would like us there in the postpartum period.
So before so let's go a little bit more into postpartum. So what is, for viewers who don't know, what is postpartum and by extension postpartum depression?
Yeah, so postpartum is basically your life after baby. And postpartum depression is actually a form of depression that occurs after childbirth. Postpartum depression is typically caused by hormones. It's a neurological disorder. It's something that's out of control, like it's not something the mother can control. And it happens when there's a lot of fatigue and just adjustment to motherhood, like the big changes that come with it.
And what are some of your, as a doula yourself, what are some of your experiences in terms of dealing with postpartum depression?
Yeah, so postpartum depression is really on the rise. The World Health Organization says that 20 to 40% of women will have it, and it's actually on the rise more in developing countries. So people that are in, developed countries, it's affecting us more than other places around the world, and I think that's important to note. I think that has a lot to do with, the millennial mom who's doing it all, and she gets burnt out, right? So what I do is that I'm there to offer, first of all, resources. Doulas are not trained care providers in terms of like medically, right? Yeah. So I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not going to sit there and solve, all those problems, but I can point you to a really great psychiatrist. I can do traditional healing methods like herbs and relaxation, guided meditation, things that would help mom recenter herself. And then, of course, get her back like nutritionally, make sure she's not too fatigued. That's what the doula is there for. It's kind of like having an older sister who's with you 24/7 to, get you nursed back to health.
So have you experienced any, so just to clarify in terms of roles, so if I, for example, have postpartum depression, I would have my psychiatrist or my doctor, and then I would also have you. So would I experience any tension between the two roles on the advice that I'm getting, or do they both work in unison with each other?
Yeah, we're really all there to facilitate your care, and so we would definitely work in unison and find ways to help you, like me at home more so, and then more so at a clinical level.
Perfect. Now I want to shift the conversation a bit, because I'm sure you've seen a lot of, what are some of the, you've dealt with clients who have postpartum depression. What are some of the misconceptions and I guess challenges out there about postpartum depression?
Yeah. I think the dads are really going to love me for this one. But I think that the biggest myth out there is that postpartum depression is somehow like only happening to mothers. It is actually happening to fathers, because they experience that same, lifestyle change. They experience that same fatigue. So it's happening to fathers as well.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Another thing I would say is that for some reason people in general and societally, like we basically correlate postpartum depression to someone who's very weak. So we kind of say, oh, she must not be able to handle motherhood, and that's why this is happening to her, because it didn't happen to me. Well, giving birth is like having a superpower. I think that it's far from weak. And so if you could have given birth, there's no way that we could say you're weak in any way, right?
And how do you think, like family, have you seen cases where, I guess maybe not to put the father down in any way, shape or form, but the father has contributed to that, not to the idea, but to postpartum depression further?
I wouldn't say that they've contributed, but I think it has a lot to do with what kind of support is available to the woman and, how much she's spreading herself out. So that's where doulas come in, where we, again, can kind of take on that bit of that burden, that bit of overwhelmingness that a new or an expectant couple might, be facing if they don't have family in town, if they don't live in a community, because if you live in a community, then there's lots of ways you can, receive help from your neighbors and from your family friends. But if you don't have that, what do you do? Where do you go, right?
And what are examples of, I know in your specific, so giving a tangible example of the kind of work that you do as a doula when it comes to helping assist with postpartum depression?
Yeah, I think the first thing I do is I give a lending hand, a hand of support, no judgments, no questions, no shaming, no guilting. It's really coming from a neutral and unbiased point of view. And I think that's really important to mention, because I'm not emotionally involved with, my clients. So I'm able to step back and really assess the situation in a neutral way, which gives me the ability to care for them in a neutral and an unbiased way. So some ways I may do that is come over to the house and help the mom. If sometimes the mom is overwhelmed because the baby might be high needs, And so we'll work on what ways can we calm this baby down, and which ways can we, help mom cope with some of the challenges she's having, maybe with breastfeeding, which can also lead to depression. Maybe she had some expectations from herself and she wasn't able to reach those expectations. Maybe she has expectations from her in-laws or her own parents or her husband. And so I'm really there to sort of be that voice of reasoning and then provide those resources in the event that she needs more than what I'm capable of helping with.
So I know earlier we talked about your role as an intermediary within the family system. So talk to me a little bit about that and how that helps with the entire situation.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest blessings of having a doula is I always say, let me be the bad guy. And there's truth to that, because what happens is sometimes we may have in-laws or our own parents or extended family who kind of download their anxiety and their worry and their expectations on us. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that we're not very good at effectively communicating. And I think that if we meet prenatally and we have a plan for that, everybody knows their roles, right? So I'll give you an example. One of the births I was at, the mother-in-law was very anxious, and she kept telling me, like, can you call an ambulance? And I'm like, Auntie, we don't need to call an ambulance. And I said, you know what, can you make us some lunch? And she was like, yeah. And so, sometimes you just need to give people a role and something to focus on and somewhere to put their feelings. It's not a good idea to dismiss those feelings because, they're just your parents and they love you and they want to make sure you're okay, right? In the postpartum period as well, where girls may go home and then their family have a certain expectation of them. So let's say you had a baby and then the next day you have a get-together to go to. And your family expects you to, go to this get-together.
Probably not a good idea.
No, because you're still learning and your baby's still learning, and that one-on-one time and that, quietness is so important. Imagine this baby who was just like in your womb where it was like nice and quiet and warm, and now all of a sudden, the baby's out there and people are touching it and kissing it, and it's that overwhelming feeling.
Just as a community, what are some things that we can do, and I guess leading from that, what are some of the symptoms of postpartum? The postpartum phase, I guess, and then obviously that leads into
so some of the symptoms that women and my clients will experience is that feel of like overwhelming guilt associated to maybe how the birth went or how it didn't go, how they wanted it to go versus what happened. So kind of processing the labor is part of that. Feelings of sadness, anxiety, fatigue, don't feel like eating, insomnia, things like that. Those are just some basic signs. And the best thing to do is if you have any of those symptoms or you feel like, just in your gut that something's not right, it's good to discuss that definitely with your medical care provider or your midwife. And as a community, the best thing we can do is just be a village. If we look at other cultures around the world, how do women have 8 to 10 children? How do they do that? And it's because they have a neighbor who can watch their children, their older, their younger children, so that it's the idea of like,
it really takes a village.
Really takes a village. And then things like meal planning, that's a huge one. So, sign up, have your friends sign up for meals so you don't have to worry about cooking take the week off, from cooking. If you need help with your groceries. The biggest advice though I would say is take the help. Because we live in a time where we like to do everything by ourselves and there's almost a stigma attached to getting help. But the resources are there, and so it doesn't have to be that difficult.
I think that's a beautiful ending to our conversation. Thank you so much, Hira.
No problem. Thank you.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.